Throughout Paris, this name sent chills down the spines of even the most hardened hearts. It was known as the antechamber of the guillotine. Located on the Île site, this medieval fortress had served as a prison for centuries. But during the Reign of Terror, it morphed into something far more sinister, a holding pen for those awaiting execution. The survival rate here was precisely zero. Every single person who entered the conciergerie left for only one destination, the scaffold at the Place de la Révolution. Imagine, for a moment, being the most famous and once most powerful woman in France, now trapped within these walls. This was the reality for Marie Antoinette. Her cell was a masterclass in calculated cruelty. It measured roughly 12 feet by 9 feet, carved from the ancient, cold stones of the fortress. Its walls were perpetually damp, sweating with moisture that seeped in from the Seine River flowing just outside. The ceiling was so low that a tall person could barely stand upright, and the single, heavily barred window, positioned high up near the ceiling, allowed only the faintest sliver of light to pierce the oppressive gloom. This wasn't just a prison cell. It was a tomb for the living. The furnishings, if you can even call them, that were deliberately sparse and degrading. There was a narrow camp bed with a thin, lumpy straw mattress, a single wooden chair, a small, rickety table, and a folding screen that provided the barest illusion of privacy. The revolutionaries had stripped her of every basic comfort, ensuring that each moment of her existence was marked by discomfort and indignity. There was no fire to ward off the biting autumn chill that seeped through the stone walls, no proper lighting for the long, dark hours, and absolutely no books or writing materials to occupy her tormented mind. But as grim as these physical conditions were, they paled in comparison to the psychological torture, the complete and utter absence of privacy. Marie Antoinette was never alone, not for a single second. 2 gendarmes armed guards were stationed inside her tiny cell at all times, their eyes constantly fixed upon her. They watched her eat, they watched her dress, they watched her use the chamber pot behind that flimsy screen. Every intimate, private moment of her existence was observed and often mocked by men who saw her not as a human being, but as a symbol, the embodiment of everything they had fought so hard to destroy. The guards rotated in shifts, but their mandate remained constant: total surveillance. They were under strict orders to note everything she did, every word she uttered, every fleeting expression that crossed her face. These observations were meticulously recorded and reported directly to the Revolutionary Tribunal, which was busy building its case against her. The message was brutally clear. She had no rights, no dignity, no claim to the basic human need for solitude. She was a specimen under a microscope, an enemy of the people who deserved no consideration whatsoever. Even at night, the surveillance intensified. A lamp was kept burning constantly in her cell, its flickering, oily light ensuring that even in the darkest hours, she remained visible to her watchers. Sleep became nearly impossible. The hard mattress, the constant light, the unnerving presence of the guards, and the horrifying sounds of the prison all conspired to deny her even a moment's rest. She would lie awake for hours, her mind a whirlwind of torment, replaying memories of her children, her executed husband, and the inevitable, terrifying fate that awaited her. The sounds of the conciergerie were a unique form of torture. The building housed hundreds of prisoners, all awaiting the same fate, and their collective fear echoed through the stone corridors. She could hear screaming, desperate crying, frantic prayers, and sometimes the eerie, heavy silence that fell after a name was called for the final journey to the guillotine. Every morning began with the same chilling ritual: the rattle of keys in the lock, the heavy groan of the cell door, and the reading of the death list. It was a macabre roll call that sent another wave of condemned prisoners to their doom. Marie Antoinette knew, with a certainty that must have felt like ice in her veins, that eventually her name would be on that list. The only question was when. The humidity in the cell was unbearable. The stones seemed to weep continuously, with moisture running down the walls and pooling on the grimy floor. This dampness, combined with the lack of sanitation, created a breeding ground for disease. Sickness was rampant throughout the prison. Typhus, smallpox, and what was chillingly known as prison fever claimed lives even before the guillotine could. For Marie Antoinette, who had been raised in the immaculate halls of palaces, the filth was a constant, visceral assault on her senses. It was another layer of degradation, another reminder of how far she had fallen. Her health began to decline rapidly. The poor diet, the lack of sleep, the constant stress, and the unsanitary conditions took a severe toll. She suffered from hemorrhages and constant pain. Yet, she was denied any meaningful medical care. The revolutionaries were content to let nature take its course, perhaps even hoping she would die in her cell and spare them the spectacle of a public trial. But Marie Antoinette clung to life, driven by a flicker of hope that she might one day see her children again. This hope was systematically crushed. She was completely isolated from the outside world. No letters from her family, no news of her children, no contact with anyone who might offer a shred of comfort. Her only interactions were with her jailers, the prosecutor, and the occasional priest who was sanctioned by the revolutionary government. Her world had shrunk to the four damp walls of her cell and the hostile faces of her guards. The psychological toll of this isolation is almost impossible to comprehend. Humans are social creatures. To be denied all friendly contact while surrounded by constant hostility is a form of torture designed to break the spirit. And yet, by all accounts, her spirit did not completely break. In the face of this relentless campaign of dehumanization, Marie Antoinette displayed a remarkable degree of composure and dignity. She rarely spoke to her guards, maintaining a regal silence that infuriated them. She kept her tattered clothes as neat as possible and insisted on washing herself daily, a small act of defiance against the squalor they had forced upon her. She carried herself not as a condemned criminal, but as a queen, even within the confines of her living tomb. This quiet resistance was her final rebellion. The trial, when it finally came, was a sham. The charges were a mixture of wild accusations, political fabrications, and outright lies, including the monstrous and baseless claim of incest with her own son. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. On the morning of October 16, 1793, after 76 days in the conciergerie, her name was finally called. Her hair was roughly shorn, her hands tied behind her back, and she was loaded onto an open cart, not a closed carriage, like her husband had received for her final journey through the streets of Paris. The crowd jeered and spat at her, but she met their hatred with a blank, impassive gaze. The woman who rode to the guillotine was a shadow of the vibrant young queen who had once captivated France. Her hair had turned white from the stress. Her body was frail, but her back was straight. She had been stripped of her crown, her family, her freedom, and her dignity. But in her final moments, she reclaimed a measure of it through her sheer, unyielding composure. Her last days in the conciergerie were a brutal, harrowing ordeal, a testament to the depths of human cruelty during one of history's most chaotic periods. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this glimpse into history fascinating, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories from the past. See you next time. On October 16, 1793, when the blade of the guillotine fell, Marie Antoinette had already experienced 1,000 deaths. The execution was just the final, brutal punctuation mark on a 76-day sentence of calculated cruelty. What the revolutionaries did to the former queen in those last months was not just punishment. It was erasure. It was a deliberate, systematic attempt to strip away every layer of her dignity, her identity, and her humanity until nothing was left but a broken shell for the scaffold. This is the story of what happened before that final moment, the story often overshadowed by the drama of the blade itself. Because while death came swiftly that autumn morning, the true horror had been unfolding slowly, methodically, in the darkness of a medieval prison. Marie Antoinette's journey to the guillotine didn't begin at the scaffold. It began in the dead of night, on August 1, 1793. Armed guards stormed the Temple prison, where the royal family had been held since their failed escape 2 years earlier. At 2 in the morning, they came for her, but not to execute her. They came to separate her from the very last thing that gave her life meaning, her children. The revolutionaries had already taken everything else: her crown, her palaces, her freedom, and her husband. King Louis XVI had been executed 8 months prior, his head displayed to a jeering crowd. Marie Antoinette had watched her world crumble, piece by agonizing piece, but her children remained. Her daughter, Marie Therese, just 14, and her son, Louis Charles, the 8-year-old boy the royalists still called King Louis XVII. That night, they took him. The boy screamed, clinging to his mother as the guards tore him away, his small hands desperately clutching her dress. Marie Antoinette fought with the primal fury of a mother losing her child, but she was surrounded, outnumbered, powerless. As they dragged him down the corridor, the last thing she heard was his voice, calling for her, growing fainter and fainter until it was swallowed by silence. They placed young Louis Charles in the care of a cobbler named Antoine Simon, a cruel and brutish man tasked with a monstrous mission to erase every trace of royalty from the boy. Simon subjected the child to a campaign of deliberate degradation. He forced him to wear the red cap of the revolution, taught him to sing songs that mocked his own parents, and encouraged him to drink and curse. The boy, who was once a prince, was made to sleep on a filthy mattress in a dark room, rarely allowed to wash, and kept in near total isolation. Within months, the golden-haired child became almost unrecognizable, his spirit systematically crushed. Marie Antoinette knew none of these specific details, but she could hear. The temple's stone walls carried sounds with a cruel efficiency. She could hear her son's cries at night, his sobs echoing through the cold stone. And then, as weeks turned into months, she heard the songs, revolutionary anthems, celebrating the death of kings and the triumph of the people, all sung in a child's voice. Her child's voice. Every note was a knife twisting in her heart. She understood exactly what they were doing. They weren't just holding him prisoner. They were trying to kill the king inside the child, to corrupt his soul. For Marie Antoinette, this auditory torture was worse than any physical pain. She would spend hours with her ear pressed against the cold wall, straining to catch any sound of her son, desperately trying to believe he was still himself, still her Louis. But as the weeks dragged on, the sounds changed. The crying stopped. The songs grew more confident. And then came the most devastating blow of all. She began to hear him denounce her. She heard her own son, coached